In the unending coverage of the still ongoing Russia-Ukrainian war, there is a particular claim about Putin's tank forces that keeps reappearing from time to time. And that is the claim that he has lost so many tanks that he has had to resort to helping himself to examples that were otherwise sat languishing in museums, which you can see in articles such as this one and this one. But is there any truth to this? It's certainly a more than fair question, as while the war certainly isn't going well for Russia, the notion of pulling tanks from museums just seems a bit out there, doesn't it? At least on a certain level. Well, ponder no further, because we've been investigating the matter ourselves, and today, in the next 20 minutes or so, we shall share with you everything that we found. So let's jump in, shall we? All right, let's begin by looking at the T-34 specifically, for which we were able to find evidence of a single example that has been kind of deployed, specifically this one. This is a T-34-85 variant specifically, and that much is very obvious thanks to the shape of its turret. But further, we can also be reasonably certain that it's a post-World War II produced one, with the first giveaway being the fact that it has reasonable quality welding all over. You see, on account of the whole Nazi invasion / cataclysmic struggle for the future of civilization malarkey that was going on, quality control wasn't exactly up there on the list of priorities during wartime, and churning things out en masse was a bit more of a pressing concern. Now, the second giveaway is the fact that it has the so-called starfish wheel type on all but one of its suspension arms, which were only introduced in 1945. Then, as the final clue, you can see that tiny little lump on the right-hand side of the turret as you look at it from front on. Well, that is something that you only see on post-war produced models, and it is there to free up internal space for the electrical turret rotation system, and you can take a look at these other basically identical T-34-85s side by side, and you can see the difference. As for its museum credentials, those we can vouch for unequivocally, because here is the exact same tank stood on a memorial plinth where it is recorded as having been since 1971. Unfortunately for us today, however, despite there being no shortage of suggestions online, particularly on Twitter, that it was being used by the Russians, said plinth is in fact in Lysychansk in Ukraine. So yes, it wasn't the Russians using it. In fact, it being used might be an inappropriate description anyway, because what actually happened, at least according to the information we were able to gather, was that it was dragged out by another vehicle and dumped at a roadblock to serve as a decoy, where it was never actually manned. This claim is backed up by the fact that when the Russians finally encountered it, which we know they did thanks to this picture of it, they didn't even bother to attack it. But while that particular T-34 may have proved to be a dead end for us today, there is another one that has done the rounds on social media, and that'd be this one. And what's more, this one was used in Ukraine by Russians, more specifically Russian separatists. What's more, thanks to the extensive modifications that have been made to it, specifically in the form of extensive armor skirting and seemingly something on the front of the mudguards, as well as the very typical huge cloud of smoke piling out the back of it, we can be reasonably certain that this one actually saw some action, or it was at least intended to see action. So while it might not have been used by the Russian army proper, do we have evidence here that the Kremlin is dishing out old T-34s to friendly paramilitaries, or that said paramilitaries are pulling T-34s off memorials bound for the front lines? And unfortunately, no, we don't have that at all. Partly this is due to the fact that we were unable to find any evidence of its origin at all, so we simply cannot say where it came from, but also the fact that this picture, which often still does the rounds on Twitter as being a contemporary one, actually comes from 2015. So no matter how it was acquired, it likely has little bearing on the situation following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine a whole 7 years later. We have a final matter to consider when it comes to T-34s, and that'd be a particular video of a trainload of them that pops up on Twitter from time to time, as you can see here. I have to admit, at face value, this one looks a bit compelling, doesn't it? I mean, come on, a whole train full of them in nice, clearly serviceable conditions. Surely this means that Russia is planning to use them, right? Well, again, no. You see, this footage, contrary to what many claim online, wasn't even shot following the Russian invasion and actually hails from 2019. Further to that, have a peek at this picture taken when Russian tank files piled on the train while it rested in a station. See that roundel just above the turret traverse budge? Doesn't look very Russian, does it? And sure enough, it isn't. It's actually Laotian. Certainly, that's a peculiar thing to see trundling down the Trans-Siberian, but there is a good reason for it. You see, Lao had the T-34, specifically ones originally made in Czechoslovakia, in frontline service all the way through to that very year, and wanted rid of them. An understandable desire indeed, given that they were 70 years obsolete by that point. Then, knowing that Russia, which really values the T-34 as a symbol of its military heritage, offered to do a swap for some T-62s. Now, couldn't believe its luck and snapped their hand off, and Russia got a bucket load more T-34s, both for its museums and its many parades. Everyone's happy. What we do see in the video is them being delivered, and that's it. We couldn't find any evidence at all of them ever finding their way to the battlefield. So then, having seen all of that, we feel pretty confident in concluding that no, contrary to what some claim, the Russian army has not been using museum and memorial T-34s in Ukraine. Never say never, of course, but we certainly wouldn't be putting any money down on them having done so. And that makes sense, because, why would they? Thanks to their Soviet inheritance, Russia isn't exactly short on far more modern tanks than the T-34, both in museums and in formal reserve, all of which are far better as fighting machines and have decades less wear and tear that has to be dealt with if they wish to get them going again. Take the T-55 alone. The International Institute for Strategic Studies estimated that they still have 2,800 of them just in reserve, never mind museum stock. So why would they ever fall back on the T-34? Our conclusion is also supported by the fact that no T-34s have turned up destroyed. Compelling evidence indeed, when you consider that in the day of the smartphone, basically every tank that gets destroyed is photographed by someone, uploaded to the internet, and documented by open source intelligence agencies, meaning that if one had been destroyed, we would almost certainly know about it. But while the matter of the T-34s may have turned out to be a dud, the same can't be said about the T-62, which is far more likely to be being pulled from museums and sent to the front. And just like we saw with the T-34, there is no shortage of people, both in the media and on Twitter, claiming with absolute certainty that that is exactly what the Russians are doing, as you can see here. And certainly, without a shadow of a doubt, Russia is taking old T-62s, carting them up a bit and pushing them out onto the front lines. The issue is with the specific claim that they are being sourced from museums and by extension memorials, as that specific detail is far harder to comment on with any certainty. Most of the articles that claim that Russia is pulling T-62s out of museums reference, or rather purport to reference, one Andrei Guralov, a former lieutenant general of the Russian army who today serves as a member of the State Duma, the lower house of the Russian Federal Assembly. More specifically, they point to a comment he made while visiting a tank assembly plant in Siberia. Many of the articles stating this didn't quite sit right with us, however. Take the Daily Mail one that we flashed on the screen earlier in the episode as an example. Early on, it throws in the following as an isolated paragraph, and we'll quote here. "It is sad that the number of exhibits of military museums will be reduced," said one report. The quote ends. And while we don't doubt that this may well have been said in a report somewhere, we have absolutely no idea which one they mean, as they completely fail to tell us. We attempted to find it ourselves by searching both English and Russian language publications, but couldn't even find so much as a trace of it. We did track down what we believe to be the original source of Guralov's comments, however, specifically to a report and accompanying YouTube video released by the regional television company Zabakalye, which serves the Zabakalsky region of Russia. And in both the written report and the YouTube video, both Guralov and the article more broadly say nothing about T-62s being pulled from museums. He does, however, go into details about how the T-62s at the plant are purportedly being modernized, and do note that we've translated this quote ourselves. The tanks are being repaired not just as a matter of routine, but with modernization. For example, the familiar T-62 tanks will be equipped with thermal imaging devices, modern night sight, significantly enhanced protection, additional armor, javelin protection, and rear protection against grenade launchers. Therefore, I believe this vehicle will perform admirably on the battlefield. The quote ends. So, with Guralov failing to offer any clarity on the matter to us, we then began trawling social media, both Twitter and VK, the latter being a kind of Russian equivalent. We were looking for anything that might help us out. Footage or pictures of them being loaded up, plinths that once held a T-62 now standing empty, maybe some further comment from a news outlet or politician. Literally anything at this point. And in doing this, we found, well, cool. From there, and finding ourselves ever more frustrated at the lack of answers, we thought of one more place to turn, and that'd be the Kubinka Tank Museum just outside of Moscow. Surely, if anyone could shed some light on the matter of T-62s being taken from museums, it'd be them, right? Then upon discovering that the phone lines to Russia are still connected, we recruited the aid of a native Russian speaker and got the following statement on the matter, which, because we want to be clear, we translated ourselves again. We are uniquely well placed to comment on this matter, for not only are we the leading tank museum in the Russian Federation, both by the size of our collection and our visitor numbers, but we are also actively part of the Russian military apparatus, with all of our staff being active duty personnel. With that said, as far as I'm aware, no, we have not had to surrender any of our collection to assist with the still ongoing invasion of Ukraine. It is simply the way of things, as most of our collection would simply be of no use to the effort, with so much of it being one-off prototypes with no spare parts available, or so antiquated that it could never be of any practical use on the battlefield. However, on the matter of the T-62, while I believe we still have our full inventory, I cannot speak for other museums, and certainly can understand the rationale that would see them be requisitioned. We are still using them on the front lines, after all, and so a logistical network already exists to support their use. I would also point out that I do not believe any are likely to have been taken from memorials, if for no other reason that there are basically no such T-62s to take, with one of the few that springs to mind being here in the town of Kubinka. I believe there is the occasional T-55 or T-54, with there being one in Velyuky and Surgut, but that's about it. The quote ends. An interesting statement indeed, but of course, the matter of whether or not we believe it, that's a whole other matter, given that Russia and the West aren't exactly on each other's Christmas card lists at the present. But for our part, largely believe the statement. For example, the claim about there being basically no T-62 memorials seems to check out. Plenty of museum collections, don't get us wrong, but seemingly very few memorials indeed. They were also correct about there being T-55s in Velyuky and Surgut, specifically this one and this one, respectively. From this alone, then, we can deduce that the person we spoke to at least knew their stuff and wasn't just feeding us a load of old bollocks to get rid of us. Furthermore, the fact that they freely admitted to being involved in an invasion of Ukraine, using old tanks therein, and left the door open to the possibility of tanks being taken from other museums, and didn't just try to force-feed us wooden propaganda lines, also inclines us toward believing them. And while we remain skeptical of it, to be sure, we are also open to the idea that Kubinka hasn't actually had to give up any of its collection, at least not its main public-facing one. As for why, better be the fact that while photos of it are much harder to come by nowadays, since the flow of Western tourists slowed to barely a trickle and the Russian government blocked many Western social media sites following its invasion of Ukraine, the few photos that do make it out appear to show the collection looking basically the same as it always had, still bristling with relatively modern stuff. For example, this and this. Now, both of those photos date from late 2023, so there is every possibility that those things might have disappeared by now. But the fact that they were still there 6 months after the Daily Mail claimed that the Kremlin was emptying museums, and even later still than Gurilov's visit to that tank workshop in Siberia, we think it'd certainly be prudent to remain open to the possibility that they are still there. And while we couldn't find a photo of any of Kubinka's T-62 specifically, we could find the one in the same town that was mentioned on our call, and here it is, in a photo that's dated September 2023. Now, none of this gives us a concrete answer, of course. Kubinka, as one of Russia's flagship military museums, could just be being uniquely preserved to save face, and that's to say nothing of other more obscure and less present on social media museums that may now be completely barren. Entertaining the notion that Russia isn't getting its T-62s from museums, or at least the amount it has taken could be grossly overestimated, also raises another question. That being, well, just where are they getting them from? That question, at least, is an easy one, because in the same way that we mentioned them having a crazy amount of T-55s in reserve in the last chapter, so too do they have a similar amount of T-62s, with the International Institute for Strategic Studies estimating that they have, give or take, 2,500 of them on hand, which, I mean, that'd do it, wouldn't it? So then, to sum up this whole chapter, is Russia taking T-62s from museums to Ukraine? We have absolutely no idea, to be honest. The evidence just isn't there to come down hard on either side. And believe us, we wish we could, because the media lying to you about X or Putin is pulling tanks out of museums would make a far more clickable title for this episode. But alas, shackled as we are by facts, there is naught we can do but lay out what evidence there is and say that there just isn't enough to be certain. Now, we were going to go into another chapter and break down another tank type, but it would largely just be a rehash of the last chapter, but with a different T-whatever, as the same situation exists. That being that we have enough evidence to speculate, but not nearly enough to be certain. So instead, for the last chapter today, let's take the time to have a quick once-over of how Russia's old Soviet tanks wherever they are actually coming from, are getting on in Ukraine. When it comes to the T-54 and the T-55, there isn't actually that much we can say, chiefly because they have been deployed in such small numbers that overall trends in patterns are difficult to map. When it is deployed, however, it appears as though it is being used primarily either as a self-propelled gun to provide indirect fire far away from danger itself, or by rearguard units that aren't expected to get caught up in anything too heavy, but need something armored just on the off chance. So scantily deployed is it, in fact, that only 8 have been documented as having been destroyed, with a further 3 having been damaged enough to be abandoned. Indeed, here are a couple of pictures of examples of that. We can talk more about the T-62, however, because it really has been Russia's go-to old tank, having been deployed in huge numbers. We also have an idea of exactly how huge that number is, because someone from the British Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office by the name of Ian Stubbs, hopefully citing secret information as mere laypeople we don't have access to, gave the number at 800 as of March 2023. More recent numbers are sadly more difficult to come by, so let's just use Ian's figure plus a bit more as a ballpark so we have something to work with in our heads. Thanks to the smartphone, however, we can at least be reasonably certain how many of them have been destroyed, and that would be a whopping 102 across all variants as of the time of writing, with examples being this one, and this one. And as if that figure doesn't sound bad enough, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Russia has been largely using its T-62s in much the same way as it has its scant number of T-54s and T-55s, i.e. out of the way, out of direct combat, largely providing indirect fire as essentially a self-propelled gun, never as the tip of a spear, unless there really is no other option in the heat of the moment. But while that might be the case, an attempt to deploy the T-62s intelligently only does so much to mitigate the fact that it has thin, outdated armor and essentially no protection against highly advanced modern anti-tank systems. So when a Ukrainian points one of them at it and pushes the big bang button, it's game over. The situation is just as dire with the T-64, the T-62's slightly younger and more advanced sibling, or with us being able to find evidence of 68 of them having been destroyed in Russian service, 3 of which you can see here, here, and here. We can also compare this to the Ukrainian experience too, as while they haven't used T-55s or T-62s, at least not to the extent that their wrecks turn up in the open source intelligence databases, they have been using the T-64, and in even greater numbers than the Russians, with us being able to find evidence of them having a staggering 320 of theirs destroyed, and here's a couple of example pictures. Now, we won't worry too much about the T-64 today, however, as since it is a tank that was never pulled from service, it really doesn't fit within our focus. But we will note one thing, that being that as a tank which is very closely related to the T-62, we have spent so much time looking at it, it further evidences the fact that these early Cold War Soviet tanks just are not up to snuff on the modern battlefield. Better than nothing? Yeah. Ideal? No. And that pretty much is it. It's another one of those annoying moments where, as much as we wish we could give you firm answers, unfortunately, there simply isn't evidence concrete enough to do so. If it had a gun to our head, forced us to climb down from the fence and pick a side to put our money on, however, we'd probably end up coming down on the no, Russia isn't pulling tanks out of museums side. When they have thousands of the same models sat in warehouses already on hand, and there's also basically no hard evidence that even really hints at them having done so, it is the only side we could reasonably put our money on. It's within the realm of possibility, however, to be sure, so who knows? Maybe new evidence will appear that would change our conclusion, or perhaps even the war will drag on for suitably long that those warehouses start running out of stock. Well, only time will tell.